This is one of a series of Good Answers presentations, offering evidence to answer skeptical challenges to the Bible's accuracy. Today we will look at the question of the origins of writing, because it bears on a claim Jesus made. He said to the Pharisees, "For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words?" John 5:46-47. Now, for centuries, Christians have taken this statement as clear evidence that the Torah was written by Moses himself to be handed down in the priest's keeping for ages to come. But in recent times, liberal scholars have challenged that idea, and for what seemed a good reason. He had no means of writing anything in Hebrew, or any other language. Here's a section heading of a very long scholarly article by one of the most respected Israeli archaeologists of our time, Israel Finkelstein. The heading says it all. No evidence for the compilation of complex texts before the early 8th century. With Moses, if he existed at all, having lived 7 centuries before this, the idea that he wrote the Pentateuch becomes a fantasy, something to laugh at. But perhaps the liberal scholars are wrong about this. The history of writing and the origins of the alphabet should tell us. To begin with, we may remember that there are 3 kinds of writing. The first uses pictures in one of 3 ways. There are pictograms, where each image just represents the object itself. An ideogram uses an image for a different purpose, to represent an idea. And a logogram calls to mind the word we know for that image, or anything that sounds like that. The second type of writing is called a syllabary. In this, a sign or symbol represents a consonant and vowel combination. And third is alphabetic. It may be proto-alphabetic, in which each sign represents just a consonant, or true alphabetic, what we all know as having a sign for each consonant and each vowel. Some examples may help, starting with picture writing. We see this image, and it calls to mind the animal. But a picture may function differently, to convey an idea, like fear. We don't interpret this as referring to the child, but to her state. And then there's the logogram, in which the picture calls to mind the word for the object. So this might call up the sound board, or even some other word that has a similar sound. 3 kinds of writing that use only pictures. Now, Egyptian hieroglyphics look like picture writing, and in a sense they are, but they involve all 3 kinds, and extra symbols have to be used to tell the reader which kind is meant. And so it requires many signs. But in simple expressions, the meaning can still be clear. Read this. That's right. I love you, Clark Gable. And note that it uses all 3 types: logogram, ideogram, and pictogram. Well then, before the alphabet, we had various signs. Cuneiform from Mesopotamia required over 950 signs. Hieroglyphic, just 800. But English speakers need only 26 letters. How would you learn all of those other symbols? You'd need years of training, and then you'd belong to a special class, scribe. These were high on the social ladder, as we know when we find elaborate tombs to house their remains. Rulers, of course, also had to learn the system. The general population, though, could not pass the bar and become literate. The system worked, but its cumbersome and exclusive character limited social development, such as the rise of a middle class. There was clearly a need for somebody to simplify this. Or was there? The privileged class may have thought not. The common people could communicate, they could speak and understand, and that was enough for them to live, work, and obey their betters. But the rulers and their scribes could send written messages to anyone near or far, and these might be things the commoners should not know. It would be enough for them to look at inscriptions the rulers commissioned, recognize the cartouche that meant our Pharaoh, and admire his achievements. Why mess with something that already works so well? But there was another system, independently developed as far as we know, the syllabary. You may have heard of Linear B from the Minoan Society on the island of Crete. When Sir Arthur Evans uncovered the city and palace of Knossos in the mid-20th century, he found tablets like these. For years, we didn't know how to decipher them, since the consensus was that they were an unknown writing system for an unknown language, and many considered this impossible to solve. Scholars saw that the system used just 87 different signs, and that was a puzzle in itself. That's too few for a system like cuneiform or hieroglyphics, and too many for a true alphabet. Eventually, two scholars, Michael Ventris, an amateur, and John Chadwick, a professional scholar, cracked the code. Each sign represented a syllable, that is, a consonant and vowel combination like this. Several signs for a syllable ending in a, da, ja, ka, ma, and several for ones using e, de, je, ke, me. The breakthrough came when they found a three-sign group that meant Knossos, the palace itself. But that system never led to a true alphabet. In fact, with 87 signs, it was still too unwieldy and was a dead end. There had to be a path to a true alphabet, and it would require a very special person to find it. Someone who understood the current system's limitations, who wanted to make general literacy possible, and who had the brilliance to see how that could be achieved. It would take an Archimedes, a Da Vinci, a Newton, or an Einstein. Now, it was all too obvious that there could never be a writing system that all people could learn so long as hundreds of signs, as in cuneiform and hieroglyphics, were required. So we look back to the basics. 3 forms of writing. All of them have the same flaw. Whether we use signs for objects, ideas, or names of things, they will have to be countless. Someone then took scissors to these. Pictograms and ideograms had to go, and even logograms requiring different sounds for different words were impossible as they stood. But if the sign for the word board could be trimmed down to just the B sound, B, and there it began. The key insight here was that there were only 20-something consonant sounds. If then one sign were to stand for one consonant sound, only 20-something signs would be needed, and at last those signs could be used to form words. This gave us a proto-alphabet and opened the way for the Greeks one day to add vowel signs and give us a true alphabet. An absolutely brilliant insight, creating a path to our alphabet, and it occurred only once in human history. All our alphabets today are variations from that first one. Well, it all began in Egypt's territory, a turquoise mine in the Sinai Peninsula. Rough inscriptions on the mine wall were found by the Petries, archaeologist husband and wife, in the year 1905. Sir Flinders Petrie was a phenomenon, a true pioneer in his profession. He worked in Egypt, but unlike those who preceded him, mostly treasure hunters, he was after knowledge. He explored, studied, and mapped countless sites, setting the standard for archaeology that has continued to this day. Don't dig until you know exactly where, in 3 dimensions, you are. And what he and his wife found in that mine would reshape our knowledge of the history of writing. Serebit el-Khadim, there east of the Gulf of Suez, was the site. Now, the consensus up to that time had been that the alphabet originated with the Phoenicians, who had a consonant-only system, followed by the Greeks, who added vowels to it. Proto-alphabetic and true alphabetic. But that development was thought to have occurred around 1300 BC or later. This was much earlier. Petrie said, "Here we have the result at a date some 5 centuries before the oldest Phoenician writing that is known. It finally disproves the hypothesis that the early Israelites who came through this region into Egypt and passed back again could not have used writing." Notice that they believed there was a connection with the Hebrews and their ability to write. That was more than a century ago, but liberal scholars still claim that the Hebrews were illiterate until about the time of King David, 10th century BC. Here is a sample of the script he found, enhanced in white. The first question was, of course, was this in any sense an alphabetic script? Sir Alan Gardiner, with the benefit of over 50 years of study by various scholars, answered the question. The case for the alphabetic character of the unknown script is overwhelming. The meanings of these names, translated as Semitic words, are plain or plausible in 17 cases. That's from his book, Egypt of the Pharaohs, 1961. And notice that the inscription is in a Semitic language. So where are we so far? We have the first proto-alphabetic script from the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, dating about 2000 to around 1700 BC. It was found in Egyptian territory, and of all places, in a mine. We do know that Egyptians used slaves to work these turquoise mines in that period. And now we could ask the next question. Who invented this script? Some pointed to a clue in the writings of Eupolemus from the 2nd century BC. Moses was the first wise man, and the first that imparted grammar to the Jews. The Phoenicians received it from the Jews, and the Greeks from the Phoenicians. But that notion just provoked laughter. Moses was 15th century, and this script appeared some 3 centuries or so before him. And in this case, we can be sure about when these inscriptions were done. Right next to the one we saw in this hieroglyphic inscription, and atop it, is the date, year 20 of the reign of the Pharaoh Amenemhet III. That would make it and the associated proto-alphabetic one 1798 BC. So we are all the way back to almost 1800 BC. Certainly not Moses then. What's next? Oh, some scholars have said it is actually Hebrew, and they have some rather convincing arguments. Take the hieroglyphic for water, which appears on the inscription. Ripples are waves. What we know of the development of Hebrew, all languages modify their letters over the centuries, shows us that the earliest Hebrew we know is the same, eventually taking on the form of Hebrew's letter M. And notice, that's the first letter of Mayim, Hebrew for water, and the hieroglyphic symbol is pronounced something like M. So a Hebrew, seeing the hieroglyphic, would think M, and in his own language, Mayim. Hard to deny the connection with Hebrew. And then there's this. Hieroglyphic for praise or jubilation is Henu, represented by a man with arms upraised. The Hebrew word for praise is halal, beginning with the letter called He. So the connection in meaning and in sound is there, and the development of the letter He reinforces that connection. It starts with a sign like this, preserving the arms raised motif. And over time, that sign is inverted to its present orientation. Since the Petries' discovery of this proto-alphabetic script in 1905, more examples have been found. Some are in Egypt itself, contemporary with the ones the Petries found. They disappear from Egypt, however, after the Exodus, never to be seen there again. But very recently, an example has been found from Canaan, dating to probably the 1300s. It's a lead cursing tablet found on Mount Ebal, the cursing mount we read of in the book of Joshua. And it contains the word Yahweh, the sacred name of God. A century or so later, the script turns up in Phoenicia, where we previously thought it had originated. And from there, the Greeks borrow it, add vowels to make a true alphabet, and it spreads to Rome and the world. And as I noted earlier, the alphabet has been invented only once in human history, and now we know it was Proto-Hebrew, invented by someone in Egypt. Well, we have followed a twisting trail to reach this point, but we began with the question, who invented the alphabet? If the foregoing evidence means that it would have been a Hebrew in Egypt, who was the first of them to live there? You are probably ahead of me here. Joseph. Brought there in the 1700s as a slave, raised to second in the land thanks to his God-given knowledge of dreams, performed magnificently and honored for his plan for surviving the 7 years of famine that followed the 7 of plenty, for which Pharaoh named him Zaphnas Paneah, sustainer of life. He would undoubtedly have become skilled in hieroglyphics, since his position would have required it. From slave to Savior, we all remember him for what he said in forgiving his brothers. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And it seems that God meant Joseph's acts for good in another way. Who else could there have been to create the first alphabet and in the Hebrew tongue? You probably know how it unfolds next. Jacob and the family come. All the persons of the house of Jacob who came into Egypt were 70. And settled in Goshen, in the eastern Nile Delta, they prosper. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. And then he who saved them from famine and brought them to Egypt at last departs this life. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. But his story is not quite over, because there in Goshen, in the city that was once called Avaris, a tomb was found, an almost royal tomb, in which there was a statue. Here are reconstruction drawings of them. The archaeologist who discovered them, Manfred Betak, had this to say about the statue. The size of the seated figure is estimated to be 2 meters high and 1.5 meters in depth, about 1.5 times life size. On the back, remarkably, you can still see evidence that this ruler was wearing a striped garment made up of at least 3 colors, black, red, and white. The skin was yellow, the traditional color of Asiatics in Egyptian art. It had a mushroom-shaped hairstyle painted red, typical of that shown in Egyptian artwork for Asiatics. A Semitic ruler wearing a multicolored coat from the time and in the location of the Hebrew territory. But Dr. Betak does not make the connection that we would. Well, Genesis records one last mention of Joseph. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and they became slaves for centuries. But God had not forgotten them, and once their exodus had left Egypt wounded and angry, what of Joseph? His body had been taken home by his people, but the tomb remained, and it became fair game. The statue had, as Betak states, been intentionally smashed and defaced. So much for that Hebrew upstart. But the Egyptians couldn't smash his alphabet. God had provided that through Joseph the Hebrews could write in their own language, and write they did, to the blessing of the world. A final word here. Why, in the larger picture, did the world need an alphabet? To enhance communication and the development of so many aspects of human culture, certainly. Imagine the benefit that the dialogues of Plato, the meditations of Marcus Aurelius, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, the plays of Shakespeare, Dante's Divine Comedy, the Principia of Isaac Newton, Einstein's History of General Relativity, not to mention Gutenberg's printing press. All were immense contributions to human knowledge and culture. But I would submit that the world needed the alphabet most of all for one single book. the Bible. Only it was God's message to a world in desperate need of Him. If you have questions about this lecture, or any of the others in the Good Answers series, you may address them to me, Dr. Jerry C. 4 at yahoo.com.